The left and the right. These terms originated during the French Revolution, where people who were in support of the king would sit on his right, and people who opposed the king would sit on his left. Over the years, these terms have stayed the same, but what each side means has actually evolved and changed. In modern times, we call this a political spectrum, and oftentimes there is a center added as well. But it's important to recognize that there isn't one standard political spectrum that everyone agrees on. Different people have different opinions about where certain political parties and political ideologies fall on this spectrum. And because people have different opinions, they will undoubtedly disagree and even argue about them. And no matter what I say in this video, there will probably be somebody who disagrees, because there just isn't a standard political spectrum that everyone follows. If you do a simple Google Images search for political spectrum, you'll notice how much these political spectrum vary from chart to chart. Some people put anarchy on the far left, while others put anarchy on the far right. Some people put Nazi National Socialism on the far right, while others put National Socialism on the far left. So you see that people can't even agree on which goes on each end of the spectrum. Also, different countries have different political parties. In the United States, for instance, we have socialists, Democrats, liberals, Republicans, conservatives, and a Tea Party. But in the European Union, there are communists, socialists, Green Party, Christian Democrats, conservatives, and right-wing extremists. But as a general rule, when someone talks about the political left, they're usually referring to communists, socialists, and Democrats. And when someone refers to the political right, they're referring to Republicans, conservatives, and libertarians. One of the primary problems with the political spectrum, and why there's often so much disagreement, is that people will try to dump the political parties or the political ideologies on an arbitrary spectrum without ever defining either end of the spectrum. Or they will define either end of the spectrum with an extreme political party rather than with an issue. You see, you could come up with a fairly accurate political spectrum if you based it on just one issue. For example, if we had individual freedom on the right, then on the left we would have complete government control. And if we had private property rights on the right, then we would have complete government ownership and community property on the left. Or we could define the right as a small government and limited governmental control, and on the left we would have big government. In terms of an economy, we could see that the right is a free enterprise, and on the left there is a planned economy. And if you placed the political parties on a spectrum based on any one of these issues, you could have a fairly accurate spectrum to go by. Of course, each spectrum would look a little bit different, because political parties have different stances on different issues. But if you did make a political spectrum based on just one issue, then it would give you an accurate look at where the political parties fall in terms of that one issue. To get into this a little more deeply, if we put political left and political right into Wikipedia, we get something like this. Left wing describes an outlook or specific position that accepts and supports social equality, often in opposition to social hierarchy or social inequality. And right wing describes an outlook or specific position that accepts and supports social hierarchy and social inequality. What I find interesting about this is that this spectrum is defined by Wikipedia in terms of Marxist theory. So it's kind of a free education in communist philosophy right there on Wikipedia. And these definitions are looking at the issues of social equality and social hierarchy. So let's dive into that as an issue. So we have social equality on the left and social inequality on the right. And it kind of sounds like a bad deal for the people on the right. I mean, doesn't social inequality sound like a bad thing? Why don't we take a closer look? One of the foundational principles in the Communist Manifesto is that social inequality is a bad thing and communism is the answer. And we could have social equality in terms of rights or any number of things, but in terms of communism, this is referring to the distribution of wealth. And social inequality would mean an uneven distribution of wealth where some people have more and some people have less. It boils down to the haves and the have-nots. And in Marxist theory, the uneven distribution of wealth causes conflicts between the classes. And the solution is for the government to scoop up all the wealth and then distribute it evenly or as needed. Recently in the United States, we saw the Occupy movement, which started with Occupy Wall Street. And some people in this movement claimed that 1% of the population controlled 99% of the wealth. And while still pretty astounding, the figure is closer to 1% of the population control about 40% of the wealth. But realize that the main thrust of this movement was to incite social strife by pointing out the social wealth inequality. In contrast, the political right is largely based on the founding fathers of the United States and on British philosopher John Locke's idea of natural rights. You know, the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. That by natural law, we all have ownership of our work, and there will probably be some inequality between different people, because each person's wealth is based on his own personal production. It basically states that each person has ownership of that which they create and the freedom to exchange it and trade it as they please. And if we look in the real universe to see what's natural, we can see that inequality is pretty natural. Some people are taller than others, some are born into more wealth than others, some are more educated or less educated, or have more or less ambition than others. But the Constitution of the United States just guarantees that we all have equal rights, not that we all have equal wealth, equal abilities, or even equal opportunities. But people don't often talk about wealth inequality. Instead, you'll hear them use terms like social inequity or social injustice. And all of these different terms are really just ways of discussing the wealth inequality. You hear about the gap between the rich and the poor. And basically, all of these terms are implying that it's somehow unfair or even an injustice for one person to earn or own more than another. But should someone who doesn't work receive the same amount of money as someone who works 50 hours a week? Should someone who works in a drive-through window make the same amount of money as someone who went to college and maybe even grad school for another 10 years? Is the value of the work done by a good doctor more or less valuable to the community than the work done by someone working in a drive-through window? So on the right, we have the idea that if someone works hard, they're entitled to the benefits of their own labor. And on the left, we have communism, which advocates the total disintegration of private property rights so that no person actually personally owns anything, and all of the property is community owned or owned by the government. Karl Marx claimed that socialism was a necessary step between capitalism and communism. So socialism isn't really an end in itself, it's just a means to the end, which is a full communist society. And the basic idea in socialism is a redistribution of wealth. So taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor, just like Robin Hood. Essentially, the government takes money from the rich or from the taxpayers and redistributes it through social services provided to the poor. So Marx had several criteria for a communist society, and one of them was a graduated income tax, meaning that the more you made, the more taxes you would pay. To give you an example, here in the United States, 70% of the taxes are paid by only the top 10% of the population, and the lower 40% income-wise don't pay any taxes at all. It's an interesting thing to note that our founding fathers were staunchly opposed to a graduated income tax, and the graduated income tax we now have in the United States is only in existence because of an amendment to the Constitution. So on the right, we have natural rights, private property, and a capitalist free market economy. And on the left, we have social rights, those which are sanctioned and dictated by the government, community property, and government-planned economy, where the government controls the production and distribution of goods. And another thing I want to point out is that Republicans in the United States have been systematically pushed more and more over to the left through a process called privatization. So basically how this works is the government takes our tax dollars and instead of performing these social services itself, it actually takes those tax dollars and pays them to a privately owned for-profit company that's then responsible for providing those social services. Some examples of privatized social services include the prison system, toll roads, the foster care system, and even privately owned hospitals and dental offices that accept Medicaid or Medicare. These are all privately owned, for-profit businesses that provide social services and bill the government, i.e. the taxpayer. And we know that we can count on a privately owned business to prioritize its own profit. And these companies are more than happy to provide social services when it's the government, i.e. the taxpayer, footing the bill. Often these are called public-private partnerships. And while that sounds all well and good, it's just allowing these for-profit companies to make their profit off of the taxpayer. It's the ultimate synthesis of capitalism and socialism. You could think of it as for-profit socialism. So now that the free enterprise privately owned companies can actually make a profit by providing social services, it's somewhat pushed the private sector and even the Republican Party farther and farther left.
Let's be honest, we've all heard of it. The political spectrum. It sounds almost as strange as it is to comprehend. Most of us have a general idea of how it goes. Socialist to the left, fascist to the right. It's as if we had many people and we just didn't know how to put them in order, so we decided to classify them and put them into boxes. However, it's quite obvious to most people that we aren't so easily put into such boxes. So how exactly does the political spectrum work? First of all, how do we acquire such political beliefs? Also known as political socialization, it's much more complex than we may actually think. A variety of factors can affect our political socialization. The first and most important factor is family. Though it is not always the case, it is very likely that the way that your family engages in political discourse will at least somewhat resemble the way you do. Other factors include your gender, race, economic standing, and residence. Although this list is by no means comprehensive, it also does show that we acquire our political beliefs in a multitude of ways, and the things that affect us most will be most likely to likewise affect our political socialization and identification. I think we're ready to start. To start, we should do what we do best. Blame another country, in this case, the French. However, this time we actually have a reason to. The entire idea of political right and left wings was actually due to the original seating of the French Parliament in 1789 to 1799. The aristocracy had to the right and the commoners to the left. Thus, the right generally stood for more royalistic ideas and the left stood for more social reform and civil liberties. Our society has changed much since that time. However, the spectrum still stands. In the United States, the Democratic Party is generally considered to the left, while the Republicans stand to the right. The left is generally considered to be more supportive of governmental control on corporations and social reform. The right tends to have the characteristics of focus on personal freedoms and more laissez-faire form of economics. There comes an immediate problem here. What happens if you don't want social reform, but you want governmental control on corporations? What if you do want social reform, but you don't want governmental control on corporations? Are those two categories mutually exclusive? On a political spectrum test, that stance would be viewed as moderate, but those two people have absolutely opposite views, and they can still get a moderate result. This has led many people to make a multiple axes political spectra. Many of these are rotations of one another, mostly emphasizing on the separation between social and economic views. On the two opposite ends of the social spectrum stands socialism, with high emphasis on power over social issues regulated by the people or community, and fascism, with high emphasis on power concentration and strict social rules and control. On the two opposite ends of the economic spectrum stands communism, originally meant to ensure equally shared economic wealth and mobility, as well as capitalism, with strong emphasis on competition for wealth and economic success. Yet even this holds multitudes of problems, however. One of the problems is the fact that there are only social and economic issues split on two axes, separating them into two perpendicular axes that seems to imply that they are mutually exclusive. For example, FDR's social reform no doubt affected the economic standpoint greatly. Issues like voting rights and civil liberties often have many roots in economic issues as well, such as income and economic status. To imply that they're completely different and separate, or even to place them on separate axes, seems to be a completely strange way of determining how you stand on political issues. After all, many important current issues fall into both of these categories. And furthermore, where does the environment stand in all of this? Does it deserve its own axis? There are many ways to look at it, and these issues are by no means labeled as either economic or social. The overlying and perhaps greatest issue with the axes and linear representation of the political spectrum lies in the whole point of its existence. The whole point of having a political spectrum in the first place is to enable us to engage in more meaningful conversation. Even though I might not agree to ideas such as fascism or socialism, that doesn't justify that they belong on extremist sides. Throughout history, we have put symbols and people, such as Hitler and Stalin, to represent certain ideas today about communism, socialism, fascism, capitalism, which are all misconstrued. We have come to believe that the lesser, the extreme, the outcasts are inherently evil. Though they may differ in their beliefs, many of them would agree with us on a multitude of ideas. Just because they may lie farther on the political spectrum should not imply that they have irrelevant discourse and cannot be reasoned with. None of them are inherently evil. In the political world, there ought not to be the idea of radical. That destroys the point of having discourse in the first place. If people are depicted as overly radical one way or another, that is discriminatory, and it defeats the entire purpose. All of us would like to believe that we exist in the center, moderate and unbiased in the political spectrum. Similar to the age-old belief that our society is the center of the world or the center of the universe, it's ultimately wrong to assume that there is even a center that is achievable. Trying to put people into boxes of radical and moderate is incorrect, and this model only deepens this crisis. Whether you believe in the political spectrum, the political graph, or anything else, in the end you have to realize that we as humans cannot be confined into numbers, data, and firm beliefs. It is our unique and individual thought that both characterizes our society and makes our society an interesting, dynamic, and conscious one. If we were all the same or classified in a certain way, our world would not only be less interesting, but also less diverse. It is this diversity that characterizes our social lives and in turn affects our political decisions. In that way, we can better appreciate our political diversity and our place within it.
When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system. Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the far left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having zero power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found the type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these five, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practical sense. It's always a group that puts one of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists. Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history. And it is the most common form of government today. Most of the nations of the world are ruled by a powerful few, and therefore oligarchy remains. At the other end, we find anarchy, which means without government. Some people have looked over history and found that many of its worst crimes were committed by governments. So they decided that having no government might be a good idea. But this is a mistake, because as the ancient Greeks stated, without law there can be no freedom. Our founding fathers agreed and held that some amount of government is a necessary force in any civilized, orderly society. In a state of anarchy, however, everyone has to guard life, liberty, and property, and the lives of family members. Everyone must be armed, and movement is severely restricted because one's property has to be protected at all times. Civilized people have always hired someone to do the guarding, a sheriff, a police force, or some branch of government. Once law enforcement was in place, the people were freer. They could leave their property, work in the fields, and so on. In short, the proper amount of government makes everyone freer. There are some who advocate anarchy, however, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. They use anarchy as a tool for revolutionary change. The condition of anarchy is very much like a vacuum where something rushes in to fill it. These calculating anarchists work to break down the existing government with rioting, killing, looting, and terrorism. Tragically, the people living in such chaos often go to those best able to put an end to it and beg them to take over and restore order. And who is best able to put an end to the chaos? The very people who started it. The anarchists who created the problem then create a government run by them, an oligarchy, where they have total power. This is exactly what happened in Russia that led to Lenin taking total power, and in Germany where Hitler's brown shirts created the chaos that brought him to power. But anarchy isn't a stable form of government. It's a quick transition from something that exists to something desired by the power-hungry. It's a temporary condition, and because it isn't permanent, we eliminate it as well. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratein, meaning to rule. Democracy, therefore, means the rule of the people, majority rule. This, of course, sounds good, but suppose the majority decides to take away one's home, or business, or children. Obviously, there has to be a limit. The flaw in democracy is that the majority isn't restrained. If more than half the people can be persuaded to want something in a democracy, they rule. What about republic? Well, that comes from the Latin, res meaning thing, and publica meaning public. It means the public thing, the law. A true republic is one where the government is limited by law, leaving the people alone. America's founders had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up an oligarchy. In fact, there were some who wanted George Washington to be their king. But the founding fathers knew history, and they chose to give us the rule of law in a republic, not the rule of a majority in a democracy. Why? Let's demonstrate the difference in the setting of the Old West. Consider a lynch mob in a democracy. 35 horseback riders chase one lone gunman. They catch him, and they vote 35-1 to hang him. Democracy has triumphed, and there's one less gunman to contend with. Now consider the same scenario in a republic. The 35 horseback riders catch the gunman and vote 35-1 to hang him. But the sheriff arrives, and he says, "You can't kill him. He's got his right to a fair trial." So they take the gunman back to town. A jury of his peers is selected, and they hear the evidence and the defense, and they decide if he shall hang. Does the jury even decide by majority rule? No, it has to be unanimous or he goes free. The rights of the gunman aren't subject to majority rule but to the law. This is the essence of a republic.